Good evening. Welcome to this Word Alive event at Charlotte Chapel. My privilege to introduce you. Let me introduce our chair for this evening, Mr. Will Clayton, an experienced chair. I'm told. So Will, over to you.
Thank you very much to Andy and to Charlotte Chapel for hosting us tonight. The motion we've got before us is biblical morality, ultimate wisdom, or outdated and dangerous, an increasingly important topic in a world where the challenges and complexities are multiplying. Speaking in favour of the motion that biblical morality is ultimate wisdom, we have Richard Lucas on my left. Richard is a member of the King's Church, and he is speaking tonight on behalf of the Solar Centre for Public Christianity, for whom he is a regular debater and writer. Speaking in opposition to the motion, on my right, we have Gary McLelland. He is a member of the Humanist Society Scotland, as well as the chair of the Edinburgh Secular Society, who he is representing tonight. Without any further ado, I'd like to welcome Richard to open the case for the proposition.
Well, I'd like to start by welcoming you to tonight's debate. It's great to see such a good turnout. I hope you find it stimulating and interesting. Thank you for Will for chairing, Charlotte Chapel as well for hosting this event, also obviously for Gary for coming along to take part. Now, in our society, the biblical moral vision competes with many others. But my task tonight is to persuade you that the biblical moral vision is the ultimate in moral wisdom. Now, one way I could do that would be to try to convince you that the Bible is a revelation from God. And if I convince you of that, I assume it would then logically follow that the contents of it would be the ultimate wisdom and morality and anything else. I'm not going to take that approach. I'm going to take a different approach this evening. Firstly, I'm going to briefly show that secular moral systems are all built on sand. And secondly, I'm going to look at specific issues where biblical teaching diverges from the modern consensus, and I'm going to argue that the biblical teaching is superior. Right, first of all, secular moral systems. Without belief in God, there's no way of generating objective moral obligations. There can be no moral facts. I believe that torturing babies for fun is wrong, and that anyone who disagrees with that is as wrong as if they claimed that 2 + 2 is equal to 5. Secular moralists can't justify such a belief. They can only offer 3 possible sources of moral knowledge: evolution, reason, and society. But all 3 of those ultimately fail. Morality is about what we ought to do, and there's no logical step that can get such a moral obligation without reference to God. There are only 2 possible sources of objective moral knowledge: conscience and revelation. The Christian view accommodates both, while atheism undermines both. Now, Gary may criticize biblical morality tonight, but it can ultimately offer nothing in its place. Now, I'm fully aware that everything I've said so far might well be misunderstood by some people. Some of you might be fuming at some of the things I've said there and thought that's complete nonsense. Well, that's what the question time's for. I'm very happy to expand on those points in the question time. But the main thrust of my argument tonight is to look at some specific aspects of biblical morality and argue for their merits. Right, so number 1, sanctity of life. The Bible presents a vision of human life as a gift from God, uniquely created in His image and inherently valuable. The value of life is not dependent on the so-called quality of life or the capacities or capabilities of a particular person. In contrast, the most famous ethicist philosopher at the moment, by the name of Peter Singer, Australian Humanist of the Year, 2004, says this: "Human babies are not born self-aware or capable of grasping that they exist over time. They are not persons. Therefore, the life of a newborn is of less value than the life of a pig or a dog." Now, if you disagree with that, Peter Singer would say you're a speciesist. You've got some sort of sentimental, irrational bias towards members of your own species. Now, the influence of biblical teaching about the unique value of human life has been eroded in our society. Already, abortion is widely accepted, but increasingly that's logically being extended to now discussion of infanticide, killing babies. This has been discussed at an academic level by both philosophers and in medical journals. And in many cultures, it's already practiced and has been in other cultures through history. People are starting to think that a baby is only valuable if it's wanted. If it's not wanted, then it's of less value than a pig or a dog, so why should anyone have to waste their energy looking after it? Also, with the decline in respect for the sanctity of life, assisted suicide is gaining ground. I'm surprised it hasn't been introduced already in this country. It's been introduced in many other countries, and I think it's the direction we're heading in. Assisted suicide for the terminally ill. Then logically it will follow assisted suicide for the ill. Then it will be extended to include the mentally ill. So we'll have assisted suicide for the depressed, which will then logically extend to euthanasia on demand, and we'll have a society that presents suicide as a valid option for people at every stage of life. And I believe that will lead to a massive waste of life. Most people who make a suicide attempt don't subsequently make another one. They carry on and live the rest of their lives. Psychologists talk about the Werther effect with regard to suicide. That when the issue of suicide is raised, people hear stories of people committing suicide. That tends to plant the idea in other people's minds, and then there's an increased incidence of suicide in the people who hear about it. Already in the media, we hear people who decide to end their lives, we hear them described as making a brave decision. Now, the inevitable corollary of that is that some people who decide to continue their lives must therefore be making a cowardly decision. So in the way we're heading, increasingly we're going to have to justify our decision to keep living. Maybe to a hospital doctor who's feeling the pressure, he needs more beds in the ward. Maybe to relatives who are feeling all this caring is quite expensive and time-consuming. I want to live in a society where everyone is wanted and cared for, and the biblical teaching helps protect such a society. Right, number 2, racism. In the biblical view, all humans are equally valuable, created in the image of God, so there's no possible grounds for regarding one race as superior or inferior to another. Now, contemporary society is also against racism, but it can lack a solid foundation for that view. If the value of people depends on their characteristics, if it's found that races have slightly different characteristics in certain areas, that could be seen as a logical justification for racism. Therefore, in our society, evidence and research into differences between races must be suppressed, whereas the biblical justification for racial equality is not so fragile. Right, number 3, marriage. The Bible presents a moral framework for sexual relationships from which our society is diverging as Christian influence diminishes. Sex creates a deep spiritual bond, a uniquely intimate sense of mutual connection that involves the deepest aspects of our personhood. Its purpose is to unite a man and wife and bring new life into being, creating the basic building block of a healthy society, the family. Therefore, the Bible teaches that marriage is the only proper context for sex, thus prohibiting pornography, prostitution, adultery, homosexual sex, premarital sex, open marriages, bestiality, polyamorous relationships, etc., etc. Now, most of those things I haven't got time to talk about in this opening speech, but I'm just going to focus on the core issue of the wisdom of marriage. Now, sex creates an emotional bond between two people, but the strength of that bond created diminishes with each successive sexual partner. So a relationship is most likely to be stable between two people who've not had sex with anyone else. In the light of that fact, it makes sense not to waste the strongest sexual bonding effect on the wrong people. It makes sense to wait until the person that you want to commit to a life together with to use that strongest bonding effect. That maximizes the chance of relational stability, which is an important factor in the well-being of adults and especially for children. Marriage ties commitment, domesticity, and sex into a single package, thus strengthening the relationship between people, encouraging spouses to persevere with one area for the sake of the others. Very broadly and generally speaking, it's been found that women in a relationship look for commitment, whereas broadly and generally speaking, men are more tending to look for sex in a relationship. Now, marriage combines those two desires, and both are satisfied, but with the system that is increasingly moving into now of cohabitation, a lot of women are cohabiting and wishing that it was marriage, but the man doesn't quite see the point. By choosing to engage in premarital sex, a person chooses to risk their relational future, of the stability of their own future relationships, of their partner's future relationships, and also the future partners of that partner. And also it could have an impact on the children from their future relationships, the partner's future relationships, etc., etc. The public nature of marriage is also an important factor in helping to create stable families. It emphasizes the public and serious nature of the promise. A few days ago, I decided I was getting a little bit too fat, so I would stop eating sweet things. So the way I did that is I announced at the family meal table, I'm not going to eat any sweet things from now on. Because that helps. Once everyone knows I've made that commitment, I'm accountable to people. Same with marriage. It strengthens the bond. There's a mountain of evidence in support of marriage. I'll just mention a few statistics. When a child is born to married parents, there's an 8% chance those parents will be separated by the child's 5th birthday. A child born to cohabiting parents who subsequently marry before the child's 5th birthday, there's a 25% chance the parents will be separated. A child born to cohabiting parents who don't marry, there's a 52% chance that those parents will be separated before the child's 5th birthday. Children born to married parents tend to be healthier, less accident-prone, less likely to self-harm, perform better in school, become sexually active at a later age, less likely to have behavioral problems, suffer depression or turn to drugs, smoking or heavy drinking, or to become involved in criminal activities. Children from cohabiting households are 33 times more likely to suffer serious abuse than those living with married parents. 60% of the prison population are from broken homes. So the biblical teaching on morality is best for society, it's best for adults, it's best for children, it's best for the environment, and it's best for taxpayers. Family breakdown has been calculated to cost the UK government £37 billion a year, roughly 6% of government spending, roughly £1,200 a year per taxpayer. Without belief that marriage is God's revealed plan, people are generally unwilling to restrain their current personal desires for the sake of the future well-being of themselves and others. Right, the next few points relate to the economy. Right, point number 4, debt. Personal debt, national debt, business debt, developing world debt are major issues in the world, and the last few years especially have highlighted the problems that they can cause. Now, in the Bible, debt is a profoundly moral issue. It's not just a matter of supply and demand. In the Old Testament, it teaches that they shouldn't charge interest on loans to the needy. So when the Archbishop of Canterbury was recently taking the Wonga payday loan company to task, the reason for that is the Archbishop of Canterbury is a man who reads his Bible, and he finds the basis for that challenge. The issue of loans to the needy, we see that again with the problems of developing world debt. The Bible also teaches caution on all loans, certainly prohibiting excessive interest, and possibly any interest at all in many cases. The Bible also points out that in many situations, taking security on a loan can be immoral. So I think the business model of a pawn shop on a biblical account is not acceptable. So around Edinburgh, cash generator shops might be a great source of cheap DVDs, but they exploit poor people's poverty. And if we follow the Bible's teaching, that business model wouldn't be allowed. The Bible also introduces the idea of jubilee, the periodic cancellation of debts. It recognizes the cycle of poverty that can be created by debt and provides a way of breaking it. Now, our economy is very different from the Old Testament times, but our economic system lacks the wisdom of the Old Testament law in restraining the negative consequences of debt. Right, number 5, distribution of land and property. In the Old Testament, each family owned a parcel of land, and it couldn't be permanently sold. If you did sell it to someone, you got it back again after a certain number of years. So a family, no matter what mess they got into, their fundamental productive resource was returned to them, so they couldn't be mired in long-term poverty. On the other hand, people couldn't build up huge personal estates to live a wealthy life at the expense of their tenants living on the land. And the same principle applies to housing as well. Now, I think that moral principle is missing in our society. It applies to land ownership, and it also applies to home ownership and letting houses as well. Point number 6, the Sabbath. In the Old Testament, God declared one day of a week to be kept separate as a day of rest. That goes through into the New Testament, through into the Christian tradition, through the ages, to have one day as a special day of rest, family time, etc. I think the Sabbath principle benefits everyone, but it's been eroded. The EU, for example, are aware of the problem of people overworking, so they have their working hours directive. You can't work more than so many hours a week. But the Sabbath principle is much more beneficial. It restricts the amount of work, but also provides common leisure time for families to be together. In our society, without the biblical principle, people are unwilling to sacrifice the relatively trivial liberties involved in order to benefit wider society. Right, point number 7. Integrity. The Bible teaches absolute integrity is necessary in personal and business dealings. And again, I think that principle has been eroded in our society. We hold our politicians to a very high standard of honesty, but I think in the general population and the business world, lying is increasingly accepted. And society pays the price when we can't trust each other. The Bible provides clear teaching. We must tell the truth. Right, point number 8, alcohol. Alcohol is a massive problem in Scotland. Half of Scottish adult prisoners and 77% of young offenders were drunk at the time of their offence. Alcohol is involved in 70% of assaults. In 1 year in Scotland, 61% of people accused of murder were either drunk or on drugs at the time of the crime. Alcohol was implicated in the death of 50 people through road accidents. Now, the Scottish government and society in general seem to be trying just anything to deal with this problem. Changing the price, giving people advice about how many units to drink, take a taxi home, campaigns against domestic violence, various educational programs. But the one thing that the government won't propose is the one thing that's necessary, which is the biblical teaching that it's wrong to get drunk. Making the decision to become drunk is inherently irresponsible because the subsequent loss of control is a significant risk of people getting hurt, yourself, others, the family, and significant cost to the state. Society recognizes the sickness but refuses the cure. We're forever hearing that we need a new attitude to alcohol, but it seems the Scottish society can't quite decide what it should be. But the Bible teaches, don't get drunk. If that attitude was taken on board in wider Scottish society, it would solve a multitude of problems and save many lives. Right, number 9, care for the poor, the sick, refugees, orphans, the needy in general. There are 3 aspects to this in the Bible. The first one is illustrated by, for example, the concept of gleaning, where in the Old Testament a farmer was instructed to harvest his field, but leave some around the edge. Don't harvest right up to the edge. Then poor people needy, can go along and take what's left, and that can keep them going. They'll have something to eat. And there's other examples in the Bible of systems that put in place to help people avoid poverty, to help people in need. That's one aspect, systems in place. The second aspect is the teaching of the Bible is very clearly that you can't delegate this to other people. We've each got a personal responsibility to get involved in the lives of needy people and to make a difference ourselves. And finally, the Bible very clearly says that we shouldn't amass financial resources for ourselves. We should share them with needy people. And I think that balance is missing in our society. I think there's too much emphasis on having systems in place to help people, and the other 2 are neglected. Right, number 10, forgiveness. Forgiveness is a paradoxical and perplexing philosophical concept, but the Bible clearly encourages us to mirror God's forgiveness of us in our human affairs. This willingness to forgive aids reconciliation, rehabilitation, restoration of relationships, personally and corporately. And it's a crucial attitude from marriage to international relations. Number 11, the Bible speaks against gossip. Don't backbite about people. Don't talk about them behind their back. If you've got an issue with someone, go and speak to them face to face. This is crucial, for example, to a positive working environment, but it's very much a neglected principle. Very few people see gossip as a moral issue, but the Bible definitely does, and the world would be a happier place if more people did as well. And my last point, number 12, is that the Bible also emphasizes the heart in morality. There's an emphasis on our thought world as well as our actions. The teachings throughout the Bible, particularly the teachings of Jesus, show that external rules are not enough. We must order our mental life if we're to act morally. Thoughts of lust, vengeance, greed, etc. are immoral in themselves, as well as leading to immoral actions on the biblical view. A pure heart is needed before our outward behavior can match. And I believe that aspect is neglected in secular ethical systems. Just to conclude, from a Christian point of view, I want to emphasize that in terms of trying to live as God wants us to live a moral life, The moral guidance in the Bible is only half of the story. You could say it's even less than half of the story. There's a more important aspect as well. When a person asks for God's forgiveness and enters into God's family through Jesus' atoning death, a process begins. Christians don't struggle to live as God wants in their own strength, but God works in their character to change them from the inside out. The Bible doesn't just present ultimate moral wisdom, it presents the means to receive the power to live as God desires. Well, that's my case. I'll hand over to Gary now. Now, those 12 points are examples of biblical morality, and Gary now has the task of showing that they're outdated, and not just showing that they're outdated, not just obsolete, but also that they're dangerous. So, over to Gary.
Thanks, Richard. Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I just want to start by thanking SOLAS, Charlotte Chapel, and Richard for the kind invitation to be here tonight. I've been criticised tonight for agreeing to take part in tonight's debate. Some fellow atheists and secularists believe that Richard's views are so offensive that to share a platform with him is wrong. I must say that I don't agree, obviously. It's true that Richard and I have very different approaches to life, as will become clear, but I think I am committed to finding a way to try and muddle through, and that's really what brings me here tonight. It's also the case that I spent my formative years as a fairly devout Roman Catholic, and I was quite happy with that. Atheism was not something that I strived for. It was a position to which I resigned myself after long and careful analysis of the evidence available to me at the time. My friends and family will attest to this struggle. Although at times I admit I have been guilty of an overzealous approach to these discussions, it was only because debates such as these were denied me as a child, so you'll understand why I find it necessary to participate in tonight's debate. So let me start by outlining my case. Before I do, let me say a big thank you to several friends and colleagues who have helped me prepare for tonight. Dr. Manfredi Lamanna, Dr. Alison Craig, Dr. Gordon Drummond, Stuart Campbell, David Hastings, Lee Symes, and a special thanks to Professor A.C. Grayling for his valued support and advice. Tonight I would try to validate a claim by Dr. Lamanna that atheists are wrong when they claim that morality can also be founded on an atheistic worldview. Instead, morality can only be founded on a secular humanistic view. All around the world at the moment, we are witnessing a revolution in terms of democratic freedoms based on a secular humanistic worldview. It's interesting to note at this point that the word revolution originally came from the Copernican theory of the revolution of the Earth around the Sun. This theory challenged the religiously based notion that the Earth was the centre of the universe, with the Sun revolving around it. Indeed, anger at this theory led to the threats of torture and death by against Galileo by the Church in the 15th century. I mention this just as when the French mathematician Laplace constructed the model of how the heavenly bodies negotiate the vastness of space. The legend has it that Napoleon turned to him and said, "But Monsieur Laplace, where is God in this model?" Laplace replies, "I have no need for that hypothesis." So it's my aim this evening to sketch for you a working model of morality which does not make use of the God hypothesis. Let me start with this simple postulate. Morality is concerned with striving to increase the total amount of well-being in the universe. I don't think that's an unreasonable opening claim, or I don't think that statement requires further expansion. If you do, then I would seriously suggest that you examine the opposite view. Given this axiom, it's clear, therefore, that certain actions are likely to lead to increased well-being, where some things are likely to lead to decreased well-being. Let us look at an example of morality in action. Let us take, first of all, the example of just over 300 years ago. The Church of Scotland's General Assembly urged a blasphemer be, and I quote, vigorously executed to curb the abounding of impiety and profanity in this land. That victim was 20-year-old student Thomas Aikenhead, who had been found guilty of challenging the authority of the Bible. Luckily, times have changed, and someone such as myself, an atheist, can engage in public discourse without the threat of death. However, the case is important because it is clear that the execution of a 20-year-old student for the victimless non-crime of blasphemy could do nothing but decrease the general amount of well-being in the universe. The outcomes are almost exclusively negative. So instead of saying that on balance it's a bad thing to do, which would be the moral relativist position, I would be clearing and affirming that under the circumstances, the execution of Thomas Aikenhead was absolutely morally wrong. It's that simple. I would like to take a minute to explain why I believe that revealed religion cannot be the sole main source of morality. I'd like to do this by describing three problems identified by Dr. Lamanna. Problem one, which God should be the basis of morality? It seems that there are at least 1,400 different gods, each claiming a total ethical monopoly on the human race. Taking just the God of the Bible, there appears to be 41,000 different types of Christian operating in our pale blue dot. Problem 2, if any religions do not contribute to the advancing of morality on earth, if any religions do contribute to the advancing of morality on earth, they do so by the benign influence of rationality. To explain, I assume that of the Christians among us tonight, very few are keeping slaves. I doubt any of you would kill your children if they offend you. I assume there have not been any witch burnings in the greater Edinburgh area this evening. And I'm quite sure we'd all get away with collecting firewood on the Sabbath without being stoned to death. The reason that none of us do these things is because we know they are wrong, despite their advocacy in the Bible, and because the progress of rationality has forced religion to move away from the morality of the Bronze Age. A short biblical quote to illustrate. This is from Numbers 15:32 to 36. And the children of Israel were in the wilderness. They found a man that gathered sticks upon the Sabbath day, and they that found him gathering sticks brought him unto Moses and Aaron, and unto all the congregation. And they put him in ward, because it was not declared what should be done to him. And the Lord said unto Moses, The man shall surely be put to death, and all the congregation shall stone him with stones without the camp. And the congregation brought him without the camp, and stoned him with stones, and he died, as the Lord Moses commanded. The process of removing the more barbaric elements of religion is intrinsically secular, even when performed by a religious authority, for the simple reason that religion has no self-correcting mechanism. So problem 3, some people, Richard being one, believe that the only answer to the question of where morality comes from, if not God, is to say it's a matter of personal opinion. To even engage in a question of this nature is to cede the argument, since there is no evidence whatsoever of any divine revelations. Since there is no evidence whatsoever of any divine revelations, we can better understand religions and religious texts as some of the first attempts by humans to make sense of the world in which we live. It's reflective, not instructive. Now, I'd like to show an example of why scripture-based morality is defective. The title of tonight's debate is Biblical Morality, Ultimate Wisdom, or Outdated and Dangerous. This is, of course, a false dichotomy. It's my belief that the Bible was written by men, and I don't mean to sound un-PC, but I'm quite sure it wasn't written by women. However, there are other moral texts available, such as the Islamic Quran, the Jewish Torah, the Book of Mormon, Hesiod's Theogony, the Analects of Confucius, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, and many, many more. There are also many and varied religious practices. Evidence from between the 51st and 300th millennia BCE shows that early Neanderthals had burial and funeral rites akin to religious practices. Anthropomorphic statues dating back to 38,000 BCE are believed to have been worshipped as deities. I don't have the time to evaluate every single religious text, but many, if not most of them, have central moral codes or precepts or practices. However, the static nature of scriptural morality means that New Age moral questions have to be answered by stretching and bending ancient codes, often embedded in agricultural metaphors. I also doubt very much whether moral precepts are useful. Take, for example, one of the simplest 10 commandments, thou shalt not kill. Now, it's often argued that kill more accurately can be translated as murder, which would make the commandment sound even more reasonable as thou shalt do no murder. On first glance, that sounds great, but what if it could be shown that by committing murder, the total amount of well-being could be achieved, such as the Christian belief in the Passion of the Christ, or what about the attempted murder of Hitler? Now, these questions are the basis of modern philosophical ethics, and there's a healthy academic community devoted to answering these questions. However, this example yet again shows support for Dr. Lamana's objection that scriptural-based morality has significantly retarded the development of morality by continuing the childish notion that morality is black and white, that every action is good or evil, every person a saint or a sinner. Although I want to demonstrate that we can construct a model for morality which does not rest in the God hypothesis, I do recognise that many Christians find the Bible a useful tool for moral reflections. On that topic, and given that we're in a chapel, I'd like to share with you my own favourite biblical verse. Quite simply, it's Matthew 7:1. I'm sure many of you will know it. Judge not, lest ye be judged. Among my less favourite of the biblically mandated injunctions are the following: death to Sabbath workers, gay people, women who show insufficient evidence of virginity on the wedding night, 70,000 people when David takes the census, Pharaoh, Egyptians, the king of Heshbon, children for the sins of their father, Amalekite children and infants, and children without pity. And finally, there seems to be at least 3 books of the Bible which appear to advocate familial cannibalism. Moving on now to my view of morality. It's worth noting at this point, there's been a steady and measurable decrease in the amount of violent death since prehistoric times, as societies become more advanced and less superstitious. Research by White, as referenced by Professor Steven Pinker, has shown that despite commonplace misconception that the 20th century was the most violent in history, over the course of the last 2,500 years, taking into consideration the number of violent deaths caused by wars, genocide, and man-made famines, the 20th century barely makes the top 10. The advancement of societies is inextricably linked to the increase of feminism, female rights, the civil rights of ethnic minority groups, equality towards lesbian, gay, bisexual, and transgender people, as well as the unbridled progress of rational scientific inquiry. I believe that just as we can have advances in understanding of scientific knowledge, we can have advances in the understanding of ethical knowledge. Moral consideration requires knowledge on which to operate. Let us take, for example, the example of the student Thomas Aikenhead. We now know that the church was wrong in its position that blasphemy is so harmful as to warrant Thomas's death. We all know that. The murder of Aikenhead by the church was morally wrong. The model for understanding morality can be summarised as so. Let us take position A as our starting point. Let us imagine that ahead of position A, position A represents a state of neutrality, a moral baseline which is neither good nor bad. Now, supposing we consider ahead of us a forked path, path 1 represents a positive sum game in terms of morality, a situation in which all possible outcomes are positive. This might be taking a country walk, listening to a favourite music track, or having lunch with a friend. Path 2, on the other hand, represents a negative sum game, where all known outcomes are bad, such as mutilating the genitals of infants, contributing to the disgraceful attitude of intolerance towards gay people in society, or murdering a 20-year-old student for the non-crime of blasphemy. Now, based on our calculation of harm, it's quite easy to see how this model can lead us to a moral understanding. Now, of course, I admit the examples I've given are very simple, but the basic model is there. The field of ethical morality is huge and cannot possibly be covered in one debate alone. Central to the understanding of morality is empathy. Empathy is central to the human experience and is the capacity to understand the feelings and emotions of others. Research on the brain by Professor Ramachandran has shown that the development of mirror neurons in the brain has shown that, is linked to, among many other things, the development of empathy. Mirror neurons actually allow the brain to subconsciously analyse and perform calculations on the behaviour of others. Whilst I am speaking now, mirror neurons in the speech centres of your brain are firing, analysing the sound, intonation, and content of my speech. This will happen either if you're watching live or later on YouTube. It seems that humans are hardwired to analyse things from the perspective of others. And Professor Ramachandran believes that mirror neurons may have played an important role in human evolution. Much like the series of failed attempts by cosmologists to place humans at the centre of the universe, the more we understand evolution and our links to other animals, we learn that empathy is not just a human characteristic. Studies on animal behaviour have shown examples of empathy in unlikely places. The following example was highlighted to me by my friend Dr. Alison Craig. The vampire bat, as its name suggests, feeds on blood. Every 1 or 2 days, the vampire bat requires a blood meal, so will venture from its cave and go in search of a cow or other suitable source of blood. On return, the vampire bat will sometimes be confronted by a set of begging vampire bats outside. Some will be genuinely unable to make the journey. Others will simply be chancing their arm. Due to the small size and stature of the bats, if they do not eat within 2 days or so, they will perish. Incredibly, the vampire bats will sometimes regurgitate blood to save the lives of other bats. Even more astonishing, they seem to show a preference for bats which they believe to be genuinely unwell, or to friendly bats which have previously helped them. So it seems that vampire bats can cough up more for their pals. Of course, there are many other examples of this type of empathy in animals. So my contention is that we can construct a model for morality which does not rely on the God hypothesis. I would like to go a bit further and suggest some scientific methods which I think would be of great benefit to the understanding of the moral landscape. Let us take the key features of scientific knowledge. Again, this is taken from my friend Dr. Lamana. Scientific knowledge is always uncertain and provisional, always open to new data, theories, or interpretations. It's anti-authoritarian. There is no absolute authority. It's anonymous. It doesn't matter who the scientist is, only what she or he does. It proceeds by relentless scrutiny by peers whose sole qualification is specific experience. So it seems to me that the list is completely antithetical to religion, which claims to be certain, immutable, and permanent. Unlike science, religion relies on an absolute unquestioning authority and does not advance by means of evidence-based scrutiny. Religious individuals have a right, even a duty, to speak their mind in the public sphere. However, I endeavour them to cede the outdated notions that the only possible path to a moral existence is contained within its ancient pages. As a secular campaigner, I appeal to the wisdom, compassion, and grace within every one of us, religious or not, to find a way to live together. Ladies and gentlemen, friends and colleagues, thank you.
Thank you. Each speaker will now have the opportunity to make a 5-minute rebuttal to points they've heard in the opposing speech.
Well, thank you, Gary. Lots to get my teeth into there. It's interesting, this sharing a platform thing. That's come up in other debates that I've done. I think if you're a Christian, I think that's increasingly the way Christians are going to be seen. Even to associate yourself with them is distasteful or foolish. Now, Gary started off by presenting his fundamental moral principle, that morality is about increasing overall well-being. Now, he stated that and said it's just obvious, isn't it? Well, I'm afraid it's not just obvious. If you can't present any reason for that, then I think that's not a foundation that can provide other people a reason to accept that. Now, you say that I should restrain things, I should not do things I want to do in order to promote the well-being of other people. Now, the question's got to be why. Now, you're all thinking now, of course you should. It's obvious that you should. But you need to be able to explain why, and I don't think Gary can do that. So Gary's basically presented a utilitarian account of morality. The important thing is you do the action that increases the overall well-being. Problems with that: how do you measure well-being? Long-term, short-term, number of people, quality, quantity, you can't measure it. How do you predict the long-term effects of an act on the general well-being of the whole world's population? Of course you can't. Okay, there might be something that increases overall well-being, but is unfair. For example, if you've got 5 people needing a transplant, you could go out into the street, bop someone on the head, take them into your hospital, kill them, take the 5 needed organs, and then you've got 5 people alive, 1 person dead. The overall human well-being has been improved, so surely that's what we're supposed to do. I don't think so. Utilitarianism is also vulnerable to what's called the open question argument. If we ask the question, that action might increase overall well-being, but is it the right thing to do? Now, I think that's an open question. That's a question that when I hear it, I think, yeah, I'll have a think about that question. If Gary's right, if you hear the question, it increases overall well-being, but is it the right thing to do? You'd say, well, that's a non-question. Of course it is. It's the same thing. But the fact that it's an open question shows that it's not the same thing. So Gary's fundamental moral principle is flawed. Now, the talk about death threats to people, religious people doing bad things in history. I'm basically going to at Galileo, etc. I'm not going to engage with those because I think they're red herrings. They're rhetorically effective, possibly, but they're not really a case, not really relevant to tonight's topic. Now, Gary said, which God? If you say morality comes from God, how do you decide which one? Well, the same way that you make other decisions. The fact that there are competing theories about something doesn't mean that they're all wrong. So when it comes to the question of which God, I approach it the same as I would any other question like that. I would assess the evidence for each one, and in the case of Christianity, it's the one that I've selected as the one that has the best evidence, the one that I'm convinced of. Having said that, which ethical theory do you choose? There are huge books full of a chapter on each different ethical theory, so the same problem presents itself to Gary. Gary talked about slavery in the Old Testament. I haven't got time to go into this, but I would defend the Old Testament's teaching on slavery as actually perfectly moral. Okay? Because slavery is a mistranslation. It's more like paid employment as we'd understand it. Maybe you can ask a question about that. But the Old Testament law in general was pragmatic. It wasn't ideal. It was to deal with people in the mindset and culture that they were in, trying to draw them forward from that. It was temporary and has now been replaced. In terms of the Sabbath disobedience, the Old Testament only specifies the death penalty for offenses relating to the 10 Commandments. And the crucial factor of them is disobedience to God. And in the people of God in the Old Testament, disobedience to God, direct disobedience, was that important. Now, Gary talked about divine revelation. Why should we accept that the Bible is divine revelation? There are historical aspects to it. I think the New Testament, in particular the Gospels, that there are good historical arguments for taking them seriously. Then there's the experience. I think people look at the Bible, act on the message, and their lives change. They encounter God. That's my experience. That's the experience of millions of Christians around the world. Then also we have the existence of the church, which again is a continuation of the story that started there in the New Testament. So there are particular reasons why I accept the Bible as divine revelation. Other holy texts, like the Quran, for example, when I look at the evidence that that might be a revelation from God, I see no evidence. I see lots of reasons to be skeptical about it. I don't see reasons to take it seriously as a revelation from God. Now, Gary made a point that religion is an aspect of all societies. I think that's, to be honest, I think that's a point on my side of the debate. Really, I think God has put in us an awareness of himself, a thirst for relationship with God, and that's why all societies through history have had some religious rituals and principles present in them. Gary complained that religion has static principles, that they don't change. He said later on, it's immutable and permanent. Okay, my principle that torturing babies for fun is wrong. It is immutable and permanent, and if Gary wants to disagree, well, that's that. Cannibalism, I have no idea where that comes from. His final point was about empathy. Empathy is not enough for morality. Okay, I can perfectly understand how an action might hurt you, but that's not the same as what motivates me to therefore refrain from it. It's not the same thing. Empathy on its own does not promote morality. Is that my time up? Yeah. Thank you.
Okay, well, just one thing struck me at the start of Richard's opening talk, which was he said biblical morality has to compete with other sources of morality in society, and I must admit I found that as a very sort of comforting view of things. I was also struck by the fact that nothing in Richard's argument he claimed biblical authority for. It was all based on a kind of secular view where he analysed the harm caused by certain actions, and he also said in his talk there that he came to his conclusion that biblically based morality is the right one because he analysed the evidence for and against and decided that was the right one. It's a perfectly secular view of the world, and if you want to ground that in one particular book, excellent, that's great. We can continue this conversation. The way it starts to fall down is the biblical authority aspect. So I'll just take a few points that he's brought up. We spoke about, for example, assisted suicide. Well, that's an interesting one. This isn't a view of ESS or anybody else, but there's a moral philosopher, Dr. Shelley Keegan at Yale, which I would encourage you to listen to. I mean, the arguments about assisted suicide are interesting, and I think we have to have a deeper conversation about it. But again, I would say Richard's view of morality significantly stunts us in that very outset because it's wrong. It's wrong because God says so, and therefore we can't engage further in the conversation, which again, I worry about that type of thing. Again, he used the assisted suicide argument to bring in the slippery slope theory, which, again, I think if we're going to have a deep, meaningful conversation about these moral issues, then you can't just plop down the slippery slope argument and walk away from it because, we have to understand these moral considerations before we make any decision based on them. Again, he spoke about coming to an objective moral standpoint, and I would say that I agree in a sense that you can come to an objective moral standpoint. However, it depends heavily on the evidence and knowledge which is presented to you. So the reason I used the example about Thomas Aikenhead wasn't to show that religious people are nasty, because we can find plenty of evidence of all different types of people being nasty. The reason I used that is because it shows that it wasn't moral authority that had changed, it was the knowledge of harm. Back in 300 years ago, the Church of Scotland obviously thought that there was significant enough harm caused by the non-crime, the victimless non-crime of blasphemy, that deserved a 20-year-old boy to be put to death. Now, we understand now enough about society to know that challenging someone's belief in the Bible isn't a capital offence. So it's not that it became less or more wrong, it's the fact that we updated our knowledge of society and understanding the supernatural beliefs of other people and to how to negotiate the public space. And when we fed that information into the process of coming to a moral consideration, we realised that, yeah, of course it's not moral to put to death a 20-year-old person for questioning the Bible. Again, most of Richard's arguments, the 12 that he put forward, for example, the wisdom of marriage, he argued that there's a lot of statistical reasons why we should promote marriage. I mean, I don't know those stats, I'd be interested to read them, but if that is the case, then brilliant, let's do that. Let's promote marriage if we can do that. But again, that's arguing from a secular humanistic point of view. That's arguing that we want to reduce harm by promoting something which is socially valuable. That's not to do with biblical authority. You can argue that from a completely atheist, humanist, secular point of view. There was one thing which I'm going to have to call you out on, which was the strength of the emotional connection diminishes with each subsequent relationship. I really don't understand that one. I mean, maybe there's evidence available. I'd be quite interested to hear of this. Again, we had more arguments about the societal damage caused by certain actions. Again, you know, let's continue to have these conversations because we have to update the knowledge of what causes harm and what doesn't cause harm. So let's keep having these conversations. But don't tell me that my morality is less or wrong because I don't believe in the Bible. That's not okay. You know, my morality comes from a very deep and thoughtful analysis of the harm caused by certain actions. I've got a lot of values and principles that I stick to in my life, and you know, so if you want to have these conversations, we'll have them, but we don't require the God hypothesis to do it. That's my basic premise. Again, Richard said that I'd sort of sneaked in a sort of premise at the start of my argument where morality has something to do with increasing the general mental well-being. I'm going to have to borrow an example here from a colleague that I can't remember his name. We don't see the same thing about medical rights. For example, medicine is, you can be medically well or medically unwell. Now, that's not an opinion or a matter of judgment. That's a fact. You know, we can come to these moral considerations based on a sort of objective view of what is moral. Thank you.
Thank you to Richard and Gary there. I'd now like to invite Richard to ask a question to Gary.
Okay, my first question is related to Gary's charge that the moral vision that I presented involved black and white aspects, immutable, absolute. So I assume that Gary is suggesting that all morality should be open to change, should be provisional. So if we return to my original example of torturing babies for fun, I'd like to ask Gary if he thinks that's a provisional conclusion that might at some stage be reviewed and we'd change our mind about that.
No, I think that, first of all, I didn't say that the arguments you put forward were black and white. I'm talking about the idea of a scripturally based morality as black and white. I think I made it quite clear that the idea of coming to an objective moral conclusion doesn't rest on, it rests on a necessary amount of knowledge and information available at the time. Now, knowledge is conditional based on what we can analyse of the current situation. So based on the current analysis of knowledge of the situation, we can analyse fairly comfortably that to torture babies for fun is only going to cause a significant amount of harm to, you know, the wider, it's going to decrease the amount of well-being in the universe, therefore it's not a moral good thing to do, it's morally wrong. There's also other reasons, for example, there's reasons of evolution. I mean, we are hardwired to empathise with babies and children. I mean, we cannot not do that. You know, there are examples of people who don't do that, we call them psychopaths, sociopaths, but babies are hardwired to fire in us an emotional connection to protect them.
So I would say to that, there's no logical connection between the facts of the case about what, for example, torturing babies for fun involves and getting to the conclusion that you ought not to do it. What's the logical connection between those?
Well, what I'm saying is, based on the knowledge of what we can calculate the possible outcomes of torturing babies for fun. Now, first of all, it's a loaded question, obviously, because I think you'd have to look very hard and wide to find somebody who'd want to torture babies for fun. The only example that comes to my mind, and this is not supposed to be anti-religious, is the genital mutilation community, which, you know, a high proportion of which are religious and use scripturally based arguments to do that. However, in the wider question, given the analysis of the harm, there is no positive outcome from for torturing babies for fun, therefore it's not a morally just thing to do, it's morally wrong.
I would say that you sneaked in your moral principle about not wanting to do harm, but you haven't explained why that's
I did. On to the next question. This might be an issue the audience wants to bring in later. Gary, your question for Richard, please.
How did you use your inbuilt reason and logic to come to the conclusion that Christianity is morally correct?
I would say the way I approached Christianity was not a sort of open intellectual inquiry that led me to a conclusion. I was brought up within a church, within a Christian family. So it was the first thing I looked at seriously. So I didn't assess the alternatives. Since becoming a Christian, I've looked at the alternatives. And that's reaffirmed my decision to be a Christian. But for me, I would say the first thing that came was experience. It was of taking the teaching I heard in the church at face value, acting on it, having experience of encounter with God, and God changes in my life as a result of that. communication with God, etc. And that's what started me on the road of becoming a Christian. I've since looked into it intellectually more, and I think intellectually it does make sense, and that's reinforced my faith. And I've looked at other faiths, and I look at atheism, and I see serious problems with them. They're incoherent in lots of ways, and I think Christianity isn't. It provides a rounded, coherent worldview that I don't see anywhere else.
A slight distinction you said there about atheism. Are you talking about atheists, or the idea that there is... Atheism obviously means the rejection of belief in gods. Are you talking about atheists or atheism?
I was talking about philosophies that don't include belief in God.
All of them?
Yes.
That's quite a wide topic.
It's the same for... In adopting any worldview, that implies that you reject all the others, no matter how many there are. It's the same for any view that we hold, isn't it?
I think that's particular to religion, that view.
Okay, thank you. Richard, have you got your second question for Gary, please?
I'll try and turn this into a question at the end. Gary came back at the slippery slope. I'd just like to clarify. And Gary, my question to Gary is, what would you like to say to this? Right, I think my slippery slope, it's not just saying, oh, this is happening, then I think this probably will, then this probably will, then this probably will. What I'm saying is, the logical argument and the worldview that's resulting in this currently, that same logic can equally be extended to produce these effects in the future. Now, unless a new argument can be put in somewhere to stop those future effects, then I think that's what's going to happen. The sort of arguments that are used to justify assisted suicide, the same arguments are used in other countries and will be used in this country to justify the progressive further steps. That's what I mean by a slippery slope. It's the same logic followed to its conclusion.
And the logic that you're talking about there, is that utilitarianism?
No, I'm talking about the logic that humans have the right, basically, to end their life as a matter of their own decision.
Okay, well...
if you allow assisted suicide for the terminally ill, how long... Well, we've already got it. You're then going to have people who are very disabled, very ill, but not terminally ill, saying this is not fair. Why can't I be helped to die? Then you get people who are saying it's not fair. He's physically ill, I'm mentally ill. Why shouldn't I?
Well, I'm confused as to whether the question is about a legal aspect or whether it's about a moral aspect. I mean, if your question is about the argument for assisted suicide will lead to an increase in laws which allow people to kill themselves for various choices, then I'm not quite sure about that because we don't know and it's not happened yet and we can't tell what's going to happen in the future. If it's about the moral question about whether somebody has the right and capacity to kill themselves, then again, I would approach that the way that Dr. Shelley Keegan does, an analysis of harm. If someone has take the example that I used before, take point A as the medium starting point. It's nearly morally wrong, nor morally right. And you have two paths. Path one is to continue with life. Now, if your general well-being becomes so poor that all you experience is pain and misery, there's no positive aspects about your life that you can experience, then there's obviously an argument there to be said, maybe this person would be more comfortable if he did not exist. Now, how you get the process involved to make that case, I'm not quite sure. However, the reason that I am not a utilitarianist is because that would be a very utilitarian argument, whereas to me, there's a very important principle of consent involved. It must be included in the analysis of morality. So I don't accept the slippery slope argument because I think what you're talking about is a legal aspect as opposed to a moral aspect.
I would say what you've just said, though, is precisely the view that justifies, I'm saying it's a slippery slope. You said if someone decides that their life isn't worth living, then that they should be facilitated for them to end their life, which is conceding the slippery slope.
Because I did make it clear that there is a very important principle of consent.
Yeah, it said anyone who wants to. You're basically saying anyone who decides that on balance their life isn't worth living, then that there ought to be facilities available for them to end their life. But that's what you said, isn't it?
Well, obviously it depends in practice because there's ethical considerations about consent of the family, consent of caregivers, consent of society. So it's not just as simple. Obviously, I used a very simple sketch to outline a godless model of morality, but when you take into consideration a real-life example, you have to take in much more nuanced calculations of harm. So I don't accept that you're trying to paint a very linear view of if we accept this moral principle, then we can just slip right down the slope to, some sort of pagan culture. I don't accept that.
I'm happy with that.
Thank you. And Gary, your final question to Richard?
What is your least favourite biblical verse?
Least favourite? Probably one's about sharing possessions.
Very honest of you. Well, but I mean, in all seriousness, I mean, since you answered that very quickly, you asked about the where the familial cannibalism comes from. Now, I can give you the quotes if you want. Jeremiah 19:9, Deuteronomy 28:53, Ezekiel 5:10. And now, obviously, we don't have time, although you do have one with you, see, but we don't have time to go into it and analyse it, but there is some pretty scary stuff in there.
Well, I have to say, I've looked a lot at accusations made at the Old Testament, and I've heard a lot, but I've never heard that one discussed in any context at all. I mean, you're right. I mean, we haven't got. We're not going to take the Bibles out and look at those and analyse them, but that's a new one on me. And I'm sure people here who've read the Bible, I would guess you don't actually recall coming across something that...
I must say, I think you've shortchanged the audience a wee bit there. I mean, you've glided over slavery as if it's been sort of fixed. I really think, I think you owe them a wee bit more.
Okay, I'll talk some more about slavery in the Old Testament. It's called slavery. Servanthood is a better idea. I'll use the word slavery. Slavery in the Old Testament was entered into voluntarily to pay off a debt. So you would effectively, instead of paying off the debt, you would agree to work for the person for a fixed length of time, and that's what you would do. Then you'd be released after a set period of time, given some gifts, and sent on your way.
What about piercing the ear with the awl?
If someone wanted to remain, if someone went into slavery, they served long enough to pay off their debt and decided that they wanted to stay with that family, that they wanted to remain there as a worker on that farm, if you like, then they could take a mark showing that they'd become a member of that family, if they decided to enter into it permanently.
Can you?
I mean, I just have people are laughing there as if having your ear pierced is some outrageous, horrifying thing.
Richard, we're not talking about ear piercings here. We're talking about taking an awl, which is, think of a sort of, like an ice pick or something, and think of putting somebody's ear against the door and gouging a hole in it. Now, this is before modern, medicine and things. How many people do you think died because of that?
Now, I'm not sure there's really information in the verse about the diameter of the implement used. I think you're embellishing a little bit there.
I think this would be a good time now to move to questions from the audience. I'd like to thank Richard and Gary for the last hour of substantive debate, and now welcome members of the audience to come forward and ask questions, please. Obviously, these should not include personal attacks on either of the individuals here, and we would like a question to be involved in the speech as well. So if you could perhaps make cues in the middle columns if you would like to ask a question, and I'll invite you to speak in turn, one from each side. It's up to you whether you wish to give your name to the audience, and you can address your question at a particular side, but both speakers will be given the opportunity to comment on what they've heard from the audience. So if I could ask you, sir, to please give your question.
Thank you. Well, good evening. The question I would like to ask both speakers is this: is there anything after this life? Is that all there is? Do you live for 60, 70, 80 years and there's nothing else? Or is there a life after death, and does that have any effect on the moral life we live now?
I think I'd like to invite Richard to answer that first.
So obviously, as a Christian, I do believe in an afterlife, and I believe for people who've been adopted into God's family, that's an eternal life with God. I think that's particularly relevant to tonight's debate because it brings out the issue of moral accountability. Because with belief in God, there's no such thing as, if I don't get caught, I'll get away with it. You're accountable for all of your actions. That's not to say God decides if we go to heaven or not on the basis of how good we've been, but we're still accountable. We face a holy God, I believe, when we die, and we're accountable for our actions. I think that's an additional moral motivation. And whatever moral motivations Gary can give, I think as a Christian I can add an extra one to them, which is an important factor.
I don't know. I really don't know. I think I certainly have no evidence to base a view that there is something after life. All that I can see is evidence that we move from a state of non-existence back into another state of non-existence. Now, I wrote a blog article about this recently. As I mentioned at the start, I was a very religious young person, and that's an aspect which I struggled deeply with when I resigned myself to being atheist. It's not something which I think flippantly about. It's not something which gives me a lot of comfort. I don't think that, because I don't have a a grand jury waiting for me up in the clouds that I can somehow make light with life and not abdicate my responsibilities. But I certainly don't think so. That's not to say that there isn't. I don't think so.
Very much.
So I wanted to ask you about sort of the seesawing it appeared to me that you did between the existence of objective morality versus the very secular justifications you gave for what you view as morality in the Bible. So what seems to be one of your main objections to a secular morality is that there is not an objective right or wrong, because there is no God basically decreeing it to be right or wrong. And then you went through, well, all the reasons that through perfectly secular, non-supernatural means we can measure that things according to you are better through the biblical worldview versus through a secular worldview. But that sort of leaves the question open, why in the world would someone who doesn't already believe that the God of the Bible is real bother with the Bible? Which is to say, if I can not believe in God and see that the Bible is moral, then I don't need that belief in God, because I can evaluate it by myself without belief in God. But then there's no need for that objective morality, is there? If objective morality is necessary, how then will the majority of humanity that is not Christian view the Bible and be able to evaluate it as a moral text? If they need the belief in your God, then there's a need for objective morality. If you don't need the need for if you don't need the belief in God, then there is no need for the absolute morality.
I think we've got a couple of questions in there.
Yeah, there are lots of people who claim not to believe in objective morality when they're engaged in philosophical discussion, but when they live their everyday lives, they certainly do. When the house is broken into or whatever, when they talk about how people should be treated, what's just and what's fair, people show that they really do believe in objective morality. But the problem is, if the theoretical basis for objective morality is lost, in the longer term, that reduces moral motivation. It reduces the status of all of moral discussion, and people are more likely, or going to be more willing, to go against what they themselves think is immoral, because it doesn't matter as much if it's not objective. Now, the issue of why follow it if you don't believe in the Bible, now that comes back to a point that Gary was saying. He was saying, for example, the facts support marriage, so promote it. That's fine, people will go along with it. But I think people won't. People are not going to look at, if you imagine two 16-year-olds deciding whether they're going to have sex or not, they're not going to think through all of the possible complications, the implications for wider society, the cost to the taxpayer, how this might affect the girls' future partners, children, etc. They're not going to think through all that. Society needs to function. It needs simple shared rules in the culture, and marriage is one of those things. It exists as a social institution, but that can only be sustained with its religious foundation. The religious foundation is being eroded in this country, and that's why marriage, the institution of marriage, in all sorts of directions, has been eroded.
Thank you. Gary, would you like to?
I was just struck there by the absolute terror or fear that two 16-year-olds might have sex. I mean, I don't know what bringing God into the argument will change about that. I mean, I think you'd maybe bring in an element of fear as a post-Catholic individual. I can tell you about the terrifying conscience, but honestly, I don't know why you would need to bring in the God hypothesis to try and stop teenagers having sex, if that's indeed what you want to do. Again, I come back to the idea that if you want to promote healthy, safe relationships, which is an admirable thing to do, then do it. Let's do it. I mean, but the other problem is when you bring in this biblical or the God hypothesis and the biblical authority, you then bring in the homophobic stuff and the judgments about other people's relationships. Which, if you want to bring something to the argument about healthy relationships, brilliant. But you need to be careful, because when you bring in your biblical authority, it comes with a load of other stuff which society nowadays doesn't really want.
Thank you.
So about the two 16-year-olds, I think I've explained at some length the consequences of that. So it does do harm, not just to them, but to other people in wider society as well.
Thank you. I'd like to invite that gentleman over there. Thank you for your question.
Hi there. This question is to Gary. My biology teacher at high school outrightly said he didn't give to charity because, you know, that's their problem, not his. Is he wrong? And if so, why? Is that a bad attitude?
I don't think it's obviously not a very nice thing to say. Don't want to be derogatory, but I don't think he and I would go on very well. I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you're trying to say that, you know, because I'm an atheist, there should be some sort of, you know, ultimate morality where we should only look out for ourselves, then no, I don't agree with that. I think that it's for the greatest good that we work together, and I think that a secular humanistic worldview gives a great platform to engage with people regardless of sexual ethics, regardless of personal philosophy. We can get together and try and work out how to negotiate these fields. Yes, I think that's a particularly, you know, a very negative approach to life.
I would say, yeah, I think the teacher's obviously wrong. I mean, you mentioned he was a biology teacher. I don't know if you were meaning significance of that. But I think someone who believes that our sense of morality is something evolved could offer a very plausible explanation about why that person holds that view. Because surely there could very easy to conceive of an evolutionary advantage of being selfish, of keeping all the produce, all the resources to yourself. It's the easiest thing to imagine. Now, you might be able to conceive of other evolutionary paths as well, but that is a viable possibility on the basis of evolution. So if people say that want to account for our morality by evolution, then I think that would fit in quite nicely to it.
Just to ask another question, Richard, what is it about evolution that makes you be selfish? Could you explain that to us?
Because there could be an advantage if creatures had a tendency to hoard more of the produce for themselves rather than sharing it. It's perfectly possible that that could be an evolutionary, a beneficial evolutionary strategy, isn't it?
I have to call you, I mean, no, there absolutely couldn't be. I mean, for example, early societies developed reciprocal altruism, which is what we understand to be the evolutionary advantage of sharing resources, pooling wealth together to promote the existence and subsistence of that society. So the idea that evolution somehow makes you selfish is just not true.
Okay, thank you. I think we'd like to now move on to another question, please. Thank you.
In 2006, a paper was published in the Quarterly Journal of Economics, Stevenson and Wolfers, that established, upon the permission of unilateral no-fault divorce across the developed world, that is, you can leave when the other person doesn't want you to leave, rates of spousal murder dropped about 30% for females and about 60% for males, which suggests that at least when it comes to keeping murder rates down, divorce might be a good thing. Number two, Richard mentioned quite a bit of detail about the idea of restraining one's alcohol consumption, and I would like his comment on the extent to which the failed policy of prohibition may be superior to the proposed Scottish Government minimum alcohol pricing.
Okay. Coming to no-fault divorce, the statistics you cited, I'm not familiar with those. I would like to look at those. I find them implausible, certainly in a Scottish context. I find them implausible. No-fault divorce, I think, demeans the idea of marriage. If you have a society where you accept that people make a solemn commitment, legal commitment to each other, then they can just say, oh, well, I've had enough, and you go, okay, right, that's it, it's finished. Then it's not a solemn legal commitment anymore. Okay? So that no-fault divorce undermines the institution of marriage. Now, I think fault divorce, obviously it's going to be messier, it's going to be more expensive, but I think as soon as you concede that people can just decide marriage is done and then that's it, so you undermine the institution. Prohibition, I didn't argue for prohibition, I didn't argue at all about any public policy. I argued that a moral standard of viewing drunkenness as immoral is healthy and would solve a lot of the problems related to alcohol in Scotland.
I think, again, Richard seems to be sliding into a legal argument about divorce. He seems to be suggesting that if we make divorce easier, more people will do it, and that's bad. Again, I think you can understand the legal framework making it easier to facilitate divorce, but I think that completely downplays the way that a humanistic perspective on relationships. You know, relationships are intrinsic to us as humans. They are the process in which we engage and we invest in other people, and it's completely necessary for society and for us as individuals. So I think to completely wash over that and say that if we make it legally more easy for people to divorce, that they will do it more often, and then therefore that's bad. And in terms of the reasons for prohibition, I don't know. I mean, I completely agree with Richard that alcohol is a problem for our society. Again, we need to take a humanist, secular approach and argue that from how to diminish harm caused by individuals.
Briefly.
Just say about divorce. Statistics show that 5 years after a divorce, 50 or 60% of people regret it. Divorcees regret it. On the other hand, people who report that their marriages are unhappy or very unhappy, 5 years later, something like 85% report it's improved and they're now happy or very happy. So I think if the law gives people cause to reflect more before getting divorced, I think that could be a positive thing.
Again.
Thank you, Gary. Can I now please have a question from here?
Yeah, I'd like to direct my question towards Richard. Two of the points he made was one against debt at the start of his argument, saying debt was immoral. Yet he goes on to say that it was perfectly okay for somebody to be accepted into slavery to pay off a debt. So you've somewhat contradicted yourself there. What's your thoughts on that?
My thoughts on that was I didn't say that debt itself is immoral. I said certainly charging excessive interest or charging interest on loans to poor people is condemned in the Bible. I didn't really go into this. There is a case. Some people interpret the Bible as banning interest on all loans. And I think there's some sense in that, and I maybe lean in that direction myself. I'm not an economist. I don't understand all about how that would work out, but I think that's something that Christians quite rightly are looking at very seriously. But I didn't say that all debt is immoral. So.
Yeah, and you had a follow-up question?
You say interest is wrong. Surely there's no greater interest in taking a person into slavery for a substantial period of time.
Okay, I think I'm just going to address this now. I think slavery was discussed quite fully earlier on and can be discussed in the cafe afterwards in the biblical interpretation of it. So if I can now please invite a question over.
The question for Richard, and if I understand you correctly, and please correct me if I'm wrong, but if I understand you correctly, you're saying that the government should say to people, don't get drunk because it's against the Bible, or get married rather than cohabit because that's what the Bible says. Now, just suppose the government did try saying these things, and people just turned around and said, well, we don't agree with you because we don't believe in the Bible. Or a lot of people said that. I mean, what would the government do then? I mean, you can't force people to believe in the Bible.
I think the reasons I gave for that view were not... I think it is the teaching of the Bible, but I think practically it makes sense as well. I think the reason the Scottish government doesn't say it is because there's too strong a culture. It would be too unpopular to say it. Now, governments are very happy to give advice on pretty well anything. Now, and they would be, if they were to give the advice, don't get drunk, that would not be any sort of anomaly as about what governments do. So I don't see that as a special case. And I'm saying, I think the reason that governments don't do it is, first of all, that the acceptance of drunkenness is so widespread that there's virtually no one in government who would actually share the biblical view. And even if they did, they would realize it would be so unpopular that they won't do it. So that's why they waste the time on all these other measures without really grasping the nettle.
I mean, again, I don't accept the reason that we have to have a biblical grounding for it. I don't, like the gentleman said, I don't understand what more that brings to the table. There is a massive problem in Scotland with alcohol, and obviously the government health boards are trying to do something about it, and we should do more of that. But again, there seems to be, and I don't know if it's to do with a religious argument, there seems to be a notion that we should boil that down to, let's try and reduce the harm caused by alcohol abuse to don't get drunk. And again, I think it's that type of black and white message which doesn't help advance the cause. To say to people don't get drunk isn't helpful. It's not going to advance the argument. If we look at the socioeconomic factors, we look at the fact that people on benefits and low incomes, have significant mental health problems, which fuels and enters into a kind of cycle of depression, which can fuel substance abuse problems and continue vast divisions amongst society. But to boil that down to the precept that don't get drunk and somehow that's going to help the matter, I don't understand.
Thank you. As we've already had one question related to the effectiveness of alcohol legislation, I would like to move on. And I know we have a very well-behaved queue system forming here. We have had a few questions in a row directed at Richard. And I would at this point like to invite the gentleman, whoever would wish to speak after this gentleman's question, sorry, it's his turn, to perhaps be somebody who'd like to address a question to Gary. That would be tremendous. Thank you.
I have more an observation than a question, actually, for Gary. My name is Diana, and I come from a country whose former dictator boasted for Albania to be the only atheist country in the world. What he did, he persecuted, he imprisoned, and he killed his colleagues. He destroyed his families. He lied, and he brainwashed the Albanians, turning them into liars, hypocrites. Husbands turned against wives, and vice versa. Neighbors were spying neighbors. The rate of alcohol and abortion was high. The early 90s found Albanians lost, and praise God for his mercy and grace. And this, I am here only because of him, of Jesus Christ. And the last I wanted to mention was, I kind of was impressed by your conclusion because you mentioned grace. And I think that there is biblical influence in you, because as an atheist, I knew nothing about grace, only when I came to know Jesus Christ. Thank you.
Thanks. I would say that although I'm an atheist, my moral views and my sense of principle doesn't come from the atheist view. The atheist view is simply that we reject the belief in some sort of God or gods. So I don't think you can derive morality from that. But when you talk about fascism, of course, I find it abhorrent, absolutely abhorrent. The communist idea has failed. Fascism is abhorrent. It goes against every grain as a secular humanist that I stand for. It's the idea that you can have a totalitarian ideology, similar in some ways, I must say, to religion, and that can offer you an answer to all the basic questions in life. It will provide you with any means you need to live, and that anything else is superfluous. That I find abhorrent, and I don't think that is an atheist principle, because atheism is a position without principles. It's simply a rejection of belief in gods. So whilst, I mean, I must admit, it's obviously very heartening testimony you give, and religion for you has given you access to some sort of moral framework, a social fabric of support, which is to be absolutely commended. You know, I'm not standing here saying that religion is completely useless and it doesn't have its you know, very virtuous points. All I'm saying is that it's not the only way in which to base morality. We can construct morality without that hypothesis, and I think if we were to leave biblical authority and absolutism out of it, I think we'll go on a lot better. And I don't mean biblical absolutism, I mean every form of absolutism, be it the failed communist type theory or fascism. I think if we leave all these totalitarian ideologies behind, as human beings, we will go on a lot better together.
Yeah, just pick up at the end again. Again, we've got this, you know, absolutism as a negative characteristic of moral beliefs. I just come back to torturing babies for fun. Is that not an absolute? Is that not a moral absolute?
I think we've been here before, Richard, but I mean, as I tried to say to you, when you apply when you try to apply and examine the moral principles behind the precept of the idea of torturing babies for fun, the outcomes are exclusively negative. Now, the reason that I was addressing Diana there was to say that the idea of totalitarian belief system, where all possible questions and belief systems are answered without any need for anything extra, that's abhorrent.
Okay, that's fine, thank you.
I assume, going back to biblical morality, depending on the denomination of Christianity will determine what you view as moral. We have, presumably you oppose same-sex marriage, the Quakers disagree. So when government is trying to answer whether equal marriage is justifiable, why should they not accept the Quakers' interpretation of biblical morality over your interpretation of biblical morality? And a quick follow-up question, would that not mean elected governments are in a stronger position to determine Christian theology than possibly the Pope is?
Right, coming to the first two, why should the government follow my beliefs than someone else? I don't think the government should follow my beliefs rather than someone else's. I think in a democracy, everyone puts forward their view. When I am against same-sex marriage, there are some some Christians who are for it, the majority against. I don't think it's unique as compared to any other issue with any other group of people in a democracy. People put forward their case, and the government makes its decision. If you don't like it, you can vote for someone else. So it's just the same as any other issue. The second part about the government deciding about Christian morality, to be honest, I didn't entirely follow that, but in general, I think the government has no say over Christian morality. I think Christian morality is revealed by God, and if the government likes it or not, well, that's up to them, but I still accept God's revelation.
Nothing? Young gentleman over here.
Garrett, you said earlier that the Christian belief is homophobic. Now, the Bible does disagree with homosexuality. Like in Genesis, it says, "A man will be united to his wife, and they will become one flesh." Now, homophobia, most people define as a kind of hatred towards homosexuality, well, for want of a better word. But Christians, well, as according to God will, are not hateful people. So, what do you think of that?
I don't think I said the Bible is homophobic. I think I said that the only way we can progress as a rational, open society is if we leave homophobia behind. I mean, you know, how you interpret the Bible is nothing to do with it. It's none of my business. You know, your divinity is of no concern to me. So I'm not particularly concerned if the Bible is or isn't homophobic. That's not my call. I do think that a lot of people who I do regard as homophobic use biblically mandated arguments. Now, to me, you can use whatever argument you want to justify it, but it's wrong. So the idea that, you know, because Christians are endeared to God and therefore good people, therefore they wouldn't be homophobic, well, that's great, but I hope you would be more angry towards Christians that use biblical arguments to be homophobic than you would be to me for arguing against homophobia.
I would say the problem with the term homophobia is just misused. It's instantly applied to anyone who expresses reservations about the moral status of homosexual sex, and it's used to demonize dissent. It's a common strategy from a mindset where if someone disagrees with you, you accuse them of having some sort of psychological condition, a phobia. So when I speak about homosexuality, I don't have an irrational fear of homosexuals. I don't hate them or mistreat them in any way, but I'll be described as homophobic. When I express my views about Islam, I'll be called Islamophobic. I did a debate about prostitution a while ago. I don't know if you've heard the latest phobia you need to be aware of. That's whorephobia, which is applied to people who disapprove of prostitution. So I think the term is misused to demonize dissent, and it's extremely effective. And I think the end point is going to be the criminalization of the expression of mainstream Christian views on the matter.
Just like to address a point there. At no point in this conversation was I levying the accusation of homophobia against Richard. I think, as I said quite clearly, and as I said to Richard in the past, it's only right and fair that we express, you know, difficult positions in the public sphere. So I'm not levelling that against Richard. All I'm saying is that there is a prevalence of homophobia in society, and I think that it's wrong.
Thank you. What I would like to do now, because we're running very short on time, is I'd like to give the speakers a couple of minutes to prepare their final summation speeches. And given that we still have some members of the audience who wish to ask questions, could I ask, please, perhaps that you give your questions and then the speakers can decide whether or not they want to include any of the points from them in their summation speeches. So if we can start with this gentleman here.
Thank you. My question was really to Gary, that a lot of your arguments against biblical morality come from this problem you seem to have with authority, and your rebuttal to Richard was based a lot on the fact that he had used a secular approach rather than basing it on authority. I think that's maybe a misunderstanding of what Richard was trying to show. Richard demonstrated that certain aspects of biblical morality can be shown to be beneficial to both individuals and society. Now, my question is, does that give us greater reasons to trust the authority if we can show that so many aspects of morality as expressed by that authority seem to accord with what reason would tell us, and we know that our reason has been unable to answer all ethical and moral questions? Does there come a point when we can be so convinced of the truth of an authority and the trustworthiness of an authority because various ethical positions and moral positions can be demonstrated to be correct?
Yes, a question for Gary. I wonder if Gary would agree with this following moral principle, which is as long as you're not doing any harm, do what you like. And I'd like Richard perhaps to comment on whose will he thinks should be done.
My question is really directed at Richard. You came up with a nice lot of figures, so I guess you like numbers. You said that you believe that your God gives you your moral judgment because either he found you or you found him. I'm not sure which way around you said. But I could show you an equal number of people who turn to that path as maybe Islam and turn to the Quran for their beliefs, or my Chinese friends who turn to Confucian analects, non-religious, and get their morals. So why do you think your God is the right one as opposed to all these other people reading books and coming to their own decision, whether religious or not?
Yeah, I've got two questions, one for each of the speakers, if that's all right. My question to Richard is, do you not think you've missed the main relevance of biblical morality to modern society, which is that the Old Testament law points to our need for a Saviour and for God's grace and repentance, rather than instituting some sort of theocracy which where everybody gets everything right all the time? And I suppose your point about alcohol and getting drunk might be that. And then on Gary, if you, essentially Richard's argument about slippery slope is that if you base an argument for assisted suicide on autonomy, then you cannot argue there's a limit to that autonomy, that where do you draw that line? So my argument, or my question really to you would be, if you don't believe in a God or some sort of source of ultimate moral authority, how do you decide where the limits on autonomy should be in human society and in human actions?
I found the discussion very interesting, and I think both of you have made valid points. You're both advocating moral positions and moral values, though you both do so from a different basis. Would you both agree that notwithstanding the different bases, you actually have a lot in common in terms of your moral values?
I'd like to ask you a question on behalf of all the women in the audience. I was going to ask Richard, but I will ask Gary. Gary, if you could please ask Richard after this debate what his sources are, so that we women might read them, that will remind us why we are not as interested in sex as much as men are.
Right, thank you very much to the audience for those thought-provoking questions. I would now like to welcome Richard to provide his 2-minute summation and closing remarks before Gary will have the last chance to speak in this debate.
Okay, thank you. Just to pick up on a couple of the questions. First of all, the source of the statistics, etc., I quoted about sex. If you're interested, a lot of them were from a book by Guy Brandon called Just Sex. It's excellent, recommend it. Someone asked, Gary and I seem to have a lot of common values. Of course we do. God put the same conscience in me as he did in Gary. That's why we have shared values across different philosophies. I didn't propose a theocracy at all, and I think part of the purpose of the Old Testament law is as a prelude to the gospel, but that's not its only purpose. That wasn't the topic tonight. The topic was looking at the content of biblical morality. I think the Old Testament's got a lot to say about that. So my personal experience, I became a Christian more from a sort of experiential route. But as a Christian, as I've matured, I've looked at the Bible very carefully, particularly at its moral teaching. And I think it really does make sense. I've looked at secular ethical theories, and I think they're built on sand. Now, I think the biblical morality makes sense. I see the benefits of it, but I also see that people don't reach those same conclusions without the guidance, without the revelation from God. Now, as Stephen said in his question, I've got to the stage where I've looked into so many issues, and I've thought, hang on, what God says here, what it says in the Bible, it does actually make sense. It works out for the best. That I've quite rationally got to the point where when I get to something where I think, I didn't quite get that, I didn't quite see why that is. I'm happy to accept that God knows best. Maybe I haven't quite worked out why it is, but God knows best. Now, I think the moral teaching in the Bible and its effectiveness that's shown by the sort of arguments I've put forward, I think it's a significant argument in favor of the truth of Christianity, significant argument for the truth of the rest of the Bible. Now, the moral teaching of the Bible is not the main story in the Bible. The main story is God created the universe and mankind, chose to reveal himself through a chosen people, Israel, leading to his appearance on earth as Jesus. Then through Jesus' death and resurrection, we can be forgiven, enter into a restored relationship with God, leading to eternal life. Now, I believe that's true. And tonight, I hope I've presented you with part of an argument, some supporting evidence for looking at the Bible and saying the whole of the Bible is reliable, including its fundamental theme, which I've just outlined. Thank you.
Thank you. And thank you.
Well, thank you. Thanks again for everyone for coming, and to Solas, Charlotte Chapel and Richard for the debate. Again, I would just like to sort of sum up by saying that I am delighted with pretty much all of the content of tonight's debate. I am particularly delighted that Richard has chosen to argue from a secular humanist point of view, to not engage in reverse engineering of moral arguments to take it all back to the God hypothesis. So I think there are a lot of really positive things to come out from this evening. Again, I would like to say that as chair of Edinburgh Secular Society, we campaign for a society where people of religion and people of no religious belief can join together, work out the answer to the moral questions, work together, live together, and all be of equal standing. I'd like to pick up on the point that Stephen asked in his question about if we can continually show that God argues in the Bible for a socially beneficial point of view in terms of morality. Is there a point at which we just say he is now so knowledgeable that we just sort of give all of our authority to him? And I must say no. I think fundamentally, as I tried to mention in my opening speech, no, we cannot do that. And I don't want to be brash about it, but I think that way lies fascism. We cannot cede all of our knowledge and authority into a totalitarian ideology. So the reason that I think that I'm engaged by the way Richard debates tonight is because he actually, at very few points in his debate, subscribed to the idea of ultimate wisdom, that it's ultimate, immutable, and permanent. It was all to do with the social benefits that come of certain actions. The gentleman asked, should morality be something like, as long as it causes no harm, do what you like? I think with certain caveats, basically yes. I mean, I think it's a great joy to be experienced in human life, and if we can do what we want, if we can get by doing and living the way we want to without causing significant harm to other fellow beings, then yes, let's do it. Thanks again.